Our speaker this evening is Dr. Andy Danylchuk, Professor of Fish Conservation, the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass Amherst. A few years back, Andy was kind enough to present to our chapter when we were live at the wonderful Eagles. And about 15 minutes into the talk, someone leaned over and said, "We got to have this guy back." So I made notes and said, let's see if we can get Andy back. A little bit about Andy. Through his life, Andy has been on a personal crusade to ensure that fish are around for future generations, whether it's at the end of a line on a dinner plate or simply to watch and wonder. His work spans both marine and freshwater systems and includes stress physiology, behavioral ecology, spatial ecology, predator-prey interaction, and adaptation to life history traits as a response to natural and anthropogenic disturbances.
I clearly need to condense my bio.
Yeah. Well, there's so much good stuff. I mean, I took some of this stuff out. Here's the exciting part. Much of Andy's work research focuses on the evaluation of potential impacts of recreational fishing on populations and making stakeholders groups to develop best practices for catch and release. Fish species that he has studied include bonefish in Bahamas, Puerto Rico and South Africa, Atlantic tarpon and permit in the Florida Keys, striped bass and sea-run bass in New England. He has also continued to do research on fish in Canada, India, Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, Guyana, and the Seychelles. Without a doubt, Andy, I think you're probably in the run for the best frequent flyers at UMass Amherst. You got the points.
Until COVID hit, of course.
Right. And if you ever need a helper to like carry buckets or anything and want to burn some of those, I'd be happy to go with you. Andy and his graduate students are working on several species of shark. For Mike Vito, that's a shack. Tigers and white sharks. Most of his work involved the use of telemetry, which we're familiar with because we've been using some telemetry recently. Andy's very active. He's a science advisor for Keep Fish Wet, member of the Science and Policy Committee for American Fly Fishing Trade Associations, several awards, including a UMass Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of Massachusetts, and also awards from other fishery education awards from American Fishery Sciences. It's great to have Andy back. Andy's going to title of his presentations is Putting Conservation to Practice with Each Fish You Release. So Thanks, Andy, for being willing to come back. And but really, if you ever need to take me anywhere to help you with research, I'm more than happy to go. Give me at least a day notice. So like,
yeah. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be back. I'm glad we did a good enough job the first time that you could actually invite us back. So it's nice to be here. I look back on the calendar and I think it was 2017. So it's been a few years. Obviously with COVID in between, we're all sort of still trying to juggle a lot of stuff, but the research continues, and there's been a lot of exciting things happening between 2017 and now, and so I'm going to use the presentation to really focus on sort of the evolution of Keep Fish Wet. It was named something different when we spoke to you last. Talk a little bit about the general practices again as a pleasant reminder for everybody, but also highlight some of the new science that's come out in the last few years, how we translate it, and where things are going to continue to go. And I'm also happy at some point to ever come back, and if you want me to talk about like a specific research project, whether it's stuff I'm doing with striped bass or stuff in the Seychelles, we can wrap another presentation around this very easily. Stuff on tarpon that we've been doing for the last 6 years is pretty amazing in the Florida Keys, looking at migration patterns. But I think all in all, I think starting with this presentation, I think, is a nice way to a segue into everything else. So I noticed that I was able to now, I am the host, so I can do this, hopefully. And I'm going to do this. I should be able to send this into, why would that go away? I can send this into view and full screen mode. All right, so you should be able to see my screen. Is that right?
Right.
All right, cool. And I can still sort of see you, which is great, or a few of you. So I'm going to talk to you today about the evolution of what used to be Keep 'em Wet. That's when we last spoke to you, and really introduce the way that we've transformed and reorganized. We're focusing on Keep Fish Wet, which is our exciting name change. We're now a U.S. 501(c)(3), so formally a not-for-profit. So it's not just a movement; we're actually a formal entity, which has given us a lot of a big foundation to expand and gain a lot of momentum, throughout the angling world. Even though the name has changed and to also include fish in the title, we've rebranded with a nice logo that very much is indicative of the broader message about best practices, and I'll get into those in a second. And really, our overarching goal is to build community around the use of science-based best practices for catch and release, not just anecdotes, not just what we think or believe or things that we've observed over the years, but have it based on fact, not fiction, and science, so that we know that when we handle and release a fish, that we're releasing a fish in the best condition possible. And so, let's see if I can do this. All right, so going back to the bigger picture about thinking about putting conservation into practice, I think we're all aware that fisheries face a myriad of threats, whether it's pollution or damming or hydropeaking or land-based influences. There is so much that is threatening our aquatic ecosystems, ranging from the highest headwater streams all the way down to the coast and into the ocean, that those impacts are also have an effect on fish. And I think embracing that and thinking that the fact that as anglers, we see and appreciate some of these threats. We know what's happening, and they operate on a very some on a short time scale, some on a long time scale. Some seem insurmountable, while others might be a little bit more tractable, and things that we can kind of do in order to help fish populations along. And then the big elephant in the room, the elephant at the bottom, is climate change, right? So we have all these other things happening, to our watersheds, and then we've got this big, ominous, dark cloud in the future in terms of what's happening, and how climate change is not only changing temperatures, but precipitation regimes. You name it. All you have to do, you don't have to think back too far to last summer, and think about all the droughts that were happening out west, and in fires and closures and things. And it was pretty abrupt, and and I think a lot tied to climate change. And then we also have to remember that these impacts don't operate in isolation, right? Some things are happening on top of each other, so there's compounded impacts. And there are organizations and entities that are fighting for change. That whether we're fighting for lobby to change policies and regulations, or we're fighting for different management regimes to happen. And some of those things take a lot of time, but they're happening anyway. Okay, so going back to the elephant, right? All these things are impacting fish populations. They're operating at different spatial and temporal scales. There's everybody has their fight and their battle. And what we're really battling for as we kind of deal with all this is trying to create some resiliency in those fish populations. That's the goal of conservation. If we want to use these fish, if we want to enjoy them at the end of the fishing line, or if we want to harvest some and eat some, we have to build populations that are resilient to a lot of these impacts. And so what is a resilient fishery, right? It's resistant to disturbance. It can handle the pushes and pulls of one disturbance, multiple disturbances. We can imagine what those might be. We want them to be able to recover quickly after an impact. So if the population is pushed or pulled in a certain direction for a short period of time, we want them to be relatively elastic and come back. We want them to be able to adapt to changes over time. And that's where we worry about water temperature and changes in hydrological regimes. Can populations adapt in order to still maintain themselves, for the long term? And conservation is all under the umbrella of really being available for future use. As anglers, recreational angling is the second most popular leisure activity in North America next to gardening. Fishing was and is the sport of the pandemic. There's lots of statistics showing that there's an amazing amount of influx into recreational angling because people weren't able to go to work. They were looking for leisure activity close to home, and they were picking up fishing rods and going out and fishing. And so really our goal, no matter what those stressors are, right, we want to create populations that are very resilient. To put it in context, though, if we think about the stuff that's more tractable, the stuff that we can do, it's also really good to revisit the scale of recreational fisheries. I've talked about how they're the second most popular leisure activity in North America next to gardening. But to build on that, over half of the fish caught by recreational anglers are released. And you might say that doesn't make sense. I practice catch and release, or there's lots of people out there that practice that fish to eat. But if there's a regulation in place, size limit, catch limit, it's out of season, you have to put that fish back. Or there's, obviously the catch and release conservation ethos that many of us have. And there's a bunch of science, and the science continues to show that catch and release on average results in a post-release mortality of around 10%. That's kind of an average. There are some situations where it's much more. There are some situations where it's much less. It's very dependent on the species, the location. So there's a lot of nuances, but if you were to take all the studies and calculate a mean or an average, it's around 10%. If you start doing it, it doesn't seem like a lot, but if you start doing the math and thinking about the scale of recreational fisheries and the amount of fish that are caught. So rough estimates for 2019 that there were 4 billion fish caught in the United States. That's a lot of fish. And a bunch of them are released, but if you do the math, 240 million of those died following release just in 2019. And then if you go back and think about the post-release mortality and the science that shows that through very subtle changes in behavior of anglers, that mortality can be reduced, and it can put a lot more fish back in the water, right? To help with the resiliency of those populations, and to also continue to drive our sport and to make sure that we have fish to target in the future. So, just with those numbers, a 1% decrease in mortality, that means 20 more fish in the water would survive each year just by simple changes in angler behavior. And so this resonates well with numbers people. When people are like, oh, 10%, that's not a big deal. If it's 10 or a couple, whatever, it's no big deal if what's 10%? You bring it back to the numbers, would you rather have 20 million more fish in the water or not? It really comes down to. And so that's where, Keep Fish Wets kind of steps in and thinking about how we translate the science to make it accessible. And this is a paper or a quote from a paper of one of my former PhD students, Jake Brownscombe. And we summarized a whole bunch of catch and release studies. And it really did show that the fate of fish after release is primarily determined by angler behavior. It doesn't necessarily require a different tool. Sometimes it does, that the investment is subtle behavioral change. And when the behavior is governed by a shared ethos in the community, that can ultimately mean more fish being released that will live another day to be caught again, that will go back to their spawning beds, that will grow, that will everything. So, we really, this quote resonates really well, and it connects the science to the stakeholders, to the anglers, to the government agencies, to other groups that mentioning the value of catch and release and how it can really contribute to the future of fish and fishing. And then we bring it back to the numbers and like, well, this is how. And it doesn't necessarily need a new regulation. It just needs a change in social norms. And so this is how we continue on with that the mission of Keep Fish Wet is really to help anglers improve the outcome for each fish they release. And although it really sort of started in the fly fishing world, we're also making a lot of inroads into the conventional tackle world, with the reminder that even if you're out there to catch to keep, there's a good chance that on any given day you're going to be practicing catch and release, whether you like it or not, unless you want to potentially get caught if you're ignoring a regulation, for instance. And what we've done over the years is continue to focus on what's in an angler's control. There's certain things that aren't, right? In terms of depending on how you're fishing and how the fish actually attacks the fly or the lure, you can't totally control exactly where the fish is going to get hooked. But there are ways that we can mitigate impacts depending if they get foul hooked and other things. We continue to, Keep Fish Wet is the only non-profit, non-NGO that's squarely in this space. It's all we focus on. It doesn't mean that habitat isn't important. It doesn't mean that other things aren't important. But it's not like one or the other, that this is a way to quickly work on creating more resilient fisheries, one fish at a time, and it can happen tomorrow. We don't have to wait for a regulation to change or things like that in order to do this. And the fact that we continue to lean heavily on the science to guide the best practices, we feel confident that the best practices that Keep Fish Wet conveys are the ones that are going to have the biggest impact on those fish that are released. Many of the board members of Keep Fish Wet and there's a scientific board, are the scientists that actually do the catch and release science. So we've shortened that distance between the scientists and the stakeholders by having a lot of those people on our team, and the fact that most of those scientists, like myself, that do a lot of work on catch and release, we also fish. We're also anglers, so we understand the motivations. We get it. We have connections to the angling industry, and so that plays a role in terms of really inserting Keep Fish Wet as a critical entity in the equation about how to create more resilient fisheries. And we also, it is through the use of these best practices, we like to remind anglers that it is an immediate way to put conservation into practice. You don't have to wait for a new regulation. You don't have to necessarily always buy a new tool, but by just practicing some of these best practices and tips, that you can actually really help with resiliency in those fisheries that we love. And so I want to kind of dissect the process a little bit and get into the three main principles and some of the tips and talk a little bit more about the science. So from a scientific perspective, what we often do is look at a situation where we have an angler in the middle. This is a colleague of mine from University of Illinois, Corey Susky. And so, he's having to make a decision right now. He's been in the Bahamas. He's caught this wonderful bonefish, and now he has to make some choices. His choices are: how do I remove the hook? Do I take the fish out of the water for a photo? How am I going to handle it? Are my hands going to be wet? Are they going to be dry? There's lots of things that go into that equation. When we're doing the science, what we do is we actually quantify and measure all of these traits so that we can relate all those traits of the angling event to the various outcomes. And in an ideal world, the best outcome for this fish would be outcome A, right? Where you put it back in the water, it looks really healthy, it swims away, and it goes on to support the population, support the fishery, support the economy. That's the ideal situation. On the other end of the spectrum is B, where because of how the fish has been handled and the stresses that are associated with it, we have some lethal outcomes, where if you're in an environment with sharks and barracuda, if that fish is overly stressed, the outcome is pretty apparent. And that fish is no longer contributing to the population or the economy or the resiliency. And then C is somewhere in between. So it's not always, and the lethal, B is relatively easy to measure, right? When you see a shark eat your bonefish, you know that there's mortality, and you can relate that back to the best practices or the handling, the way the fish was handled. C, we talk about, these are the sublethal effects. So how do you know when if it's not going to be affecting the immediate post-release mortality? Depending on how the fish is handled, are there things that are going to be affecting it down the road? Is it going to be able to feed the same way for a short period of time, so affecting its energy? Is it going to be maybe more susceptible to disease because you've accidentally wiped all the slime off it? And so that's where the science is starting to go a little bit more, is trying to understand these sublethal effects. And we do that in various ways through some of the technology that you used on the Deerfield River, some acoustic telemetry or radio telemetry, depending on the system. We do a lot of blood physiology. And so even though we're anglers, right, we'd love to be fishing more, we also want to dissect it. We want to create these best practices and not only understand what contributes to the lethal effects or the post-release mortality, but the sublethal effects. And that's where a lot of the science is going, and what we've been doing for quite some time, and continue to do it as the tools and techniques continue to evolve a little bit more. And so and you might say this is, yes, we're going into winter, and maybe some of you are thinking about going to the Bahamas, maybe if we can get there and go fishing for bonefish, but this also applies to trout. There have been more studies done over the last little while that are showing, it might not be post-release predation because of sharks and barracuda, but ospreys, other things I've seen studies where, there are fish that die because of herons, that because of the post-release, there's post-release mortality in freshwater systems. If you're in a lake and there's bigger predatory fish, post-release mortality can happen that way. So this is it isn't just in saltwater systems, and it's also not just the post-release mortality that's tied to predation. Depending on how much we handle the fish, that mortality could just be due to physiological stresses that we place on the fish, especially if the conditions aren't ideal. And so, see if I can adequately change my slide. So I want to take this time to talk about go through each of the three main principles that Keep Fish Wet uses. We'll talk a little bit about the science behind it and some tools and tricks that people can use. The first principle is to minimize air exposure. There's been a couple of review studies. If you go through all of the literature about the science on catch and release, most of the science says that 10 seconds or less is okay. The gold standard is you don't take the fish out of the water at all. If we also are an organization that, we don't want to alienate people. We want to stick to the science. And if the science says 10 seconds or less is okay, if you have people if you're catching a trophy fish, or, we're not saying take every fish out of the water for a photo, because that might be a little much. But if there's a reason to take a photo, we'll talk about this later. For taking that picture of that prize fish that you catch, there are ways to do it where you can keep it down to less than 10 seconds. We've done studies on steelhead, we've done studies on bonefish, we've done studies on bass, we've done studies on multiple species of trout, regardless of the environment, there are different ways that air exposure can impact fish. It really does play a major role. Stepping back one step back, the other thing that's tied to this is thinking about how fish's gills actually work, and how fish actually get oxygen from the water. And so I'm going to open it up. I always, I teach in a very Socratic way at UMass. So how do fish get their oxygen? Anybody want to volunteer? Randy, can I pick on you?
So water has to move across their gills.
Water has to move across their gills. So the dissolved oxygen is in the water, right? But how does that dissolved oxygen actually get into their blood?
I think it's an O2 CO2 exchange that's similar to our lungs.
It's actually different, and this is where we thank you for volunteering. And it's actually a little different, and I'm going to show you in the next slide. And this helps. It helps a lot when we teach this across the board. Come on. So yes, fish only get oxygen from the water. Yes, there are a few exceptions where fish gulp air and they can use their swim bladder, but they're the exception as opposed to the norm. And really the science is about, what extent is air exposure bad. So the way that actually, can you guys see my cursor when I move it?
Yes.
There? Sweet. Okay. So water flows in through the mouth, across the gill lamellae, and out the operculum, so out the gill flaps. And the reason why that flow direction is important, and you can see it on the right side here, we've got the water flowing in one direction and you have the blood flowing in the other. And because of that counter current, it creates a pressure gradient. It's counter current exchange. There's only a thin layer of cells right there, so it allows the dissolved oxygen to diffuse from the water into the blood. And so it's different than the way our lungs work, the alveoli in our lungs. It doesn't really require that counter current in our lungs. And it's why that when you see a fish sitting in the water, it's actually, when it opens its mouth, it actually closes its operculum. There's a little flap of skin. What it's doing is it's filling its buccal cavity with water, and then it closes its mouth and it opens its operculum. So it pushes that water in the direction from the mouth through the operculum, and because that's opposite than the direction of the blood. And so that's why when we often, when you hear about people like trying to recover fish and they hold their fish into the current, you're trying to maximize that water flow going in through the mouth and out over the gills. And we also can't forget. So Eric, you also nailed it too, that there's carbon dioxide exchange that's happening here, but the gills are also vitally important for ion regulations, for salts, and also for osmoregulation for water. And so very different from our lungs, the gills are a multi-purpose organ for these fish. It's not just oxygen, and it's CO2, it's ions, it's all sorts of different things. And that's why I think they're particularly sensitive, and why, our first principle is to minimize air exposure, because even if the fish could hold its breath, it's still not getting rid of the carbon dioxide. It's impacting ion exchange. So the compounded effects of air exposure are much greater than we might normally think. And so it's really important to consider the ways that we can minimize air exposure, especially because the fact that what's happened before we potentially expose a fish to air is we've exercised it on the end of the line, right? So its respiration is up. It's like thinking about going for a run around the block 3 or 4 times. You're respiring, and then somebody involuntarily holds a bag over your head, right? That fish needs to recover, and immediately if you angle it and you land it and you expose it to air, you're not helping with that recovery at all. You're actually making it worse. And so, across the board, the air exposure, if you can minimize it, keep it less than 10 seconds, keep it even to 0, that's the best for the fish. And we'll get into some different tools and tricks in a second, but I'm going to go through these principles before we get there. And feel free to stop me along the way. If you have any questions, don't save them till the end, because it's easier to do that now. All right. The next principle is to sort of eliminate contact with dry or hard surfaces. Fish have a layer of slime on them, and that helps with hydrodynamics, and it also helps with reducing infection and parasites. And so the more that we can do to not drag them across the rocks, not use abrasive gloves, using wet hands, that alone can also play a big role in minimizing post-release mortality and post-release impacts. And quite often, when we're talking about this, if you use a net, so I've got my net here with my Keep Fish Wet net sticker, the best nets are these rubberized nets and because they don't have any knots in them, like the conventional, Walmart nylon nets, that is less abrasive on the skin of the fish and the filaments between the fin rays. It actually, when it's wet, it's actually a little slippery, so it's not going to remove a lot of the slime. So we've done a lot of studies, even since we spoke to you in 2017, that showing that how different net materials really do make a difference for minimizing that rough surface. So do keep that in mind. If you're in the market for a new net, definitely look for a rubberized net. I tend to like for me, my personal preference, I tend to like the clear ones because I often fish both in hot and cold conditions. And I find that the clear ones, if they're on your pack or in a boat, the sun doesn't heat them up. So you want to make sure, like, if you're going to use this on a fish and that rubber nets are all really hot, I tend to like the clear ones better. It's just personal preference, but I've noticed that difference too in terms of just temperature of that material. Some science that was kind of neat with some of the grad students that we have. We actually looked at how placing a fish on the deck of a boat or on a carpet how that influences the slime loss. And it's pretty considerable. It's up to like 30 or 40%. And so we really want to minimize contact with harder dry surfaces. And then the third one is how to reduce handling time. So fish are wild animals, right? They don't want to be in our hands. They want to get back and do their thing. Confinement, holding them, even in a net, is stressful. And so handling time is from the time that you land the fish in terms of the time that you let it go. It's not just in your hands. It could be in a net. If you're a bass fisher, it's in the live well, whatever, that you have to think about it from the time that it's landed to the time that you let it go. And the more that you can reduce that handling time, the better. Now, of course, if the fish looks stressed, or if you are preparing to release the fish, and so hang on, I'll get my trout here. So I've got my rubber trout. And so what we do for a lot of the science now are using things called reflex indicators. And one of the reflex indicators that we use is a writing reflex. So in some of the science, we test how long, if your fish is vigorous and we roll it upside down, does it take 3 seconds or less to do this, right? To bring it back upright, because that means it has coordinated fin movements. It means it's ready to swim off on its own, right? And so we actually use that for some of the science. We actually, how many people have also noticed when, if you roll a fish on their side a little bit, their eye kind of tracks you? Has anybody seen that before? Yeah. Okay. So we use that as an indicator too. If you look at it, and we've systematically looked at fish that are really physiologically stressed, and a fish that is super stressed out physiologically, that eye roll is gone, right? It's no longer trying to fixate on the horizon, and so those are some indicators that we use. The reason why I bring that up is that, if you are, say you fight a fish, you bring it in, you take the hook out, you decide not to take a photo, or you take a quick pic, and you put it in the water, and it kind of does a little bit of that nosedive. You can bring it back to you. That's an indication that fish is not quite ready to go. And then you can find ways to whether move it to cooler water if you're in a stream, or if, say you're in an eddy that might be a little warmer, move it to cooler water. Put its head into the current so it maximizes that airflow. And then you can test just by looking at a few of those reflexes, use that as an indicator to let it go. Sometimes we see people hold on to the fish a heck of a lot longer than they need to, because if they think that the longer they hold on to it, the better it is for the fish, even if it's like fighting and wanting to get away. If that fish wants to go, let it go, because it's stressed in your hands, right? Remember, these are friendly, happy, wild fish, and they don't. And we've done some science to actually show that the prolonged confinement, it can actually it increases the rate of recovery, and so we want to make sure that we reduce handling time as much as possible. So those are the three main principles that really additively play a big role in minimizing the post-release, the negative outcomes that can happen to fish. And then there's a ton of these tips. And the reason why we bundle these tips together is that a lot of them serve to help out different principles, or multiple principles. And the big one is using barbless hooks. Barbless hooks should be a no-brainer for most of us, in that it reduces physical injury depending on what you're fishing with and fishing for. It would allow you to turn the hook and reduce handling time by being able to get that hook out of the fish faster. If you have to, we advocate the use of any sort of dehooking tools. These ones by Loon are kind of neat. I've got some other ones hanging around, but these ones have a little dehooking. Oh, shit, where's my camera? There we go. These ones have a little dehooking mechanism here, but they also serve you can see the barrel there. Boop. But they also serve double duty because they're also, basically a pair of pliers. So it's one tool that serves many purposes. But if you use a barbless hook, then obviously you can get that hook out faster. You can reduce handling time. Limit the fight time. So really match your tackle to what you're fishing for. That's not always the case, right? Because inevitably you catch something bigger than, well, hopefully you catch something bigger than you're targeting or thinking you're going to catch. But how do you actually make sure you want to limit that fight time? We see this a lot with more novice anglers that really want to get the most out of that fish. Or if you've been skunked for a long time and you get a fish on and you've been waiting for that fight and you fight it for one more run, or we really want to limit that because that's creating a lot of that physiological response that can prolong recovery. We talked about using rubber nets. To me, that is, there's enough science behind that to be like, yeah, you use the rubber nets, don't worry about anything else. If you happen to, want to take a picture of your fish, or you're taking the fish out, say you're in a boat, don't bring the fish into the boat to take the hook out, because then you're increasing air exposure. And then if you drop the fish on the boat, then there might be some physical injury. We always say, like, hold the fish over the water. Whenever you're doing anything with the fish, keep it over the water, because if it lands in the water, that's where it's happiest. And so hold your fish over the water is great. Limit the use of lip grippers, not as important in trout fisheries, but if you're out on the Cape and you're fishing for striped bass, or down in the Bahamas fishing for bonefish, sometimes the guides will actually keep a boga grip or a lip gripper in the boat, and they want you to use that because they're afraid of you getting your bass thumb or being crunched on by a bonefish. But guess what? It's not that big of a deal if it happens. And we've got some science that shows that those things actually do quite a bit of physical damage to the jaws of fish. There was a study on barramundi in Australia that actually showed, especially when a fish is being held up by a grip, it actually dislocated vertebrae in the fish's back. And you can't see that, right? You don't know that's happening, but then you let the fish go and it's got a dislocated vertebrae. That could impact things like avoiding predators, swimming performance, you name it. So really avoid those lip gripping devices if you can. Going back to hook removal tools, I'm a big advocate for these, and have them at the ready. You want to basically, whether you have them in your hip pack, or there's on a retractor somewhere. These things are, you want to be fumbling around for your tools as your fish is flopping around in the net. You want to be able to have all your stuff accessible as best as you can, so that you're organized and ready for that fish. You want to grip fish carefully. So a lot of times we see, if somebody's taking a picture of a fish, we often see this one where they're holding the fish like really tightly. They've got one fish around the back end of the caudal peduncle, and you often see I can pull up pictures of the internet, and there's lots of people like this. And we don't want to see knuckles. Now you want to rest your hand in here. If you're squeezing, and how many people have seen this? You seen this before? Right? Yeah. Okay. So the fish's heart is right here, right? It's like almost right underneath so here's the operculum, right? Where the gills are. And the heart is kind of like right in here. And a lot of other important organs are right in here. So if you're doing this, right, and the fish is trying to recover from that stressful event, you could be doing some damage to those internal organs. So what we often say is you use your A-OK sign, and if you use an A-OK sign, you can do it this way. You rest your hand under the fish, don't grip. And we say, like, if you are going to take a picture, and make sure that fish is dripping, and we don't want to see knuckles. It's best not to see knuckles, because then that's showing that you're kind of digging into the fish. We covered this a little bit. Only revive fish that cannot swim away. And I see this over and over again with lots of anglers. I'm going to just take care of this fish a little bit longer because it, treated me so well. It's like, wow, it's kind of kicking in your hands. You might want to just let it go. we want to be careful with that. Photograph fish wet. There's also really good ways, and I'll show you in a second, if you've got, even your iPhone and you're taking photos, there are ways that you can get really good angles if you're by yourself with the fish in the water, and making sure that you do have enough water going over the gills, or if you're with somebody, we'll talk about this again in one more slide, let them call the shots, the photographer call the shots so that the fish is actually dripping. If this isn't so much for fly anglers, but consider using artificial baits. If you get into the conventional tackle world, fish like to really hoover down live bait or dead bait, worms, minnows, whatever, and that results in some deep hooking. So we want to make sure that in that situation, artificial baits tend to be a little bit bigger. Think twice before going after spawning fish. And this came up, I was on a podcast with April Vokey last year before, where there's some controversy about fishing on reds. And, could that really be impactful because fish have so many eggs, and, how could that be a problem? Well, maybe one fish is not a problem, but if you're fishing multiple reds and those fish are, if those populations are being impacted by water temperatures and stream flows and all those other things, then maybe fishing on reds is probably not a good idea. And then lastly, be wary of warm water. This one is it's tied to that elephant in the room, right? It's not only just climate change, but even warm water conditions. And I bring that up because we're going to need to be a lot more aware about water temperature. Water temperature is the master factor when it comes to fish. Fish are ectotherms. They're not like us. Their body temperature, their metabolism, and everything is regulated, controlled by ambient water temperature. So how fast they respire, how fast they breathe, how they feed, how fast they grow, when they reproduce, how fast their babies grow, where they distribute in a lake or stream, the depth profiles, where they reside, their swimming speed, their survival. It's all water temperature plays a major role in all of that. And if we start coupling changes in water temperature with changes in water flow, then these fish are in trouble. And we also need to be especially careful then if we're going to go fishing for them. If their metabolism is already high, if they're already stressed, and then we exercise them on the end of the line, then all those best practices are even more important. So this is also why we really think about those best practices. You have to consider the context by which you're fishing. You might say, well, I take trout, when it's cooler, that's when I'm okay taking trout out of the water for a quick picture. But when it's warmer, I'm going to be even more careful because of issues with water temperature. So just be aware. And this is when, it's really handy to carry a thermometer, think about where you're fishing, what the time of day that you're fishing, and even questioning whether you should be targeting trout, or if it's so hot, go fish for bass or carp or something else that may be a little bit more tolerant of warmer water conditions. So I think, but we're going to experience this. We were slapped in the face big time last year when it came to all the droughts and heat waves out west. We saw them in Europe, and a couple of years ago we had a pretty bad drought here too. And so water temperature is tied to that. So wrapping it up, I think we all like to take our fish pictures, and so if you do need to take your fish picture, we always and we build the science into this. Get ready. So have the excuse me. Whew. Have the person with the camera call the shots. And if you can invest in it, they're probably kind of cool. We've got like the Aquatech housings for your iPhone. These are great. Sometimes you can put a dome on them. You can actually operate the phone in the back still. It's got a little squishy membrane here. These are awesome. If you only want to have one device out with you, but GoPros work really well. Some phones are, if you're brave enough that they're waterproof to a certain rating, you could dunk your phone if you want. But regardless, whoever's taking the photo, have them call the shots, have them be ready. Get low, change the camera angles. So the picture on the right here, this is Heather Hodgson, one of our ambassadors. That if depending on if you have a camera with a dome, or if you're ready to really get that camera angle low, you can get a fabulous shot of the fish. You can get a fabulous shot of the fish and you in the photo without taking that fish out of the water. And then count it down. So this is on the lower left. That's actually Sasha, the executive director for Keep Fish Wet, so also my wife. But this is up in the Yukon fishing for grayling, and so she's got her fish in the water, and she's the person with the camera is counting it down, saying on 3, 2, 1, lift the fish out, click, put it back in the water. Right? That's not even 10 seconds. That's 1 second. That's 2 seconds. And so if you're prepared, it really takes very little time to still get that photo. What we often see is, hey, can you go get the camera? This is a really good fish. The camera's in my pack over there. Okay, we'll go get it. And the person goes get the pack, and the other person still has the fish on the water, right? Like, you got to let the person with the camera call the shots, keep the fish in the water, and also ask yourself too if you need a picture of every fish that you catch. And that goes with the other, the sort of the more philosophical side of things, is also be mindful of the conditions. If the water's really warm, if you're fishing in the salt and you see predators around, be careful and ask yourself, like, is this the time that I should be concerned about taking a picture of a fish? Because ultimately it goes back to each fish, each angler playing a role in the conservation of fisheries and the resiliency, one fish at a time. And so it's about being mindful. It's about being prepared. And yes, in this particular slide, not everybody can afford a housing for their camera or for their phone, but you don't need it, right? You just philosophically, you can get some great pictures just by using it, creative angles. Cool. So I'm going to end here and say, what can you do, right? And this is where it's really about learning and adopting best practices. So when Keep Fish Wet transitioned into an official not-for-profit, a US 501c3, we made a conscious decision not to be member-based. And the reason why we did that is to reduce barriers to access, even if it's just a perception. We don't have memberships. What we have is an advocate program, and the advocate program is free. We don't want to limit access to the information. There's a link on the website to become an advocate. You have to read through the principles and take a pledge. And once you do that, you're part of the growing community to be a Keep Fish Wet advocate. And that really helps with the way that we can update people on how the science evolves and how the best practices evolves. And tied to this, we have a set of ambassadors, we have industry partners that support what we do. And it's through those connections, rather than asking memberships to pay annual dues. This is why we have our fundraising drives and other things that we just had. And we just had a successful one that ended yesterday. And we actually surpassed our goal, which is great. But I think that part of what you can also do is share, right? And what's important, and I've seen this over my last 20 years of working on recreational fisheries, is what's needed is a consistent and persistent message. And that's why I think that when you have the opportunity, direct people towards Keep Fish Wet. because it's science-based, because of the connection to science-based best practices that have been tested to show that they actually work. I think that is another thing where we can build community and really have that tie back into the resiliency of our fish populations, whether they're brown trout in the Deerfield or striped bass on the Cape or anything else you fish for. And so I'm going to I've been going on for quite some time, and so I'm going to end on this slide and keep that up there. And if people want to ask questions, I'm happy to address them. So.
Thanks so much,
Andy. Appreciate that. Hey, Andy, we have one from Paul. Paul, will you?
I see it. Never mind.
Yeah.
What does the science say?
Him to unmute himself.
Yeah. No.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I've been fishing since I was in diapers, and always was taught if you hook a fish deep that you want to let go, just cut the hook off. And so we've always done that, but I've always wondered, what happens to that fish? Does that, the wives' tale is that hook rusts out in a few days if it's not a saltwater hook. But I don't know if there's any science behind that, or that's just folklore.
Nope, that's a great question, and you're spot on. For deeply hooked fish, we've done some science, and you do want to cut the line. We've actually done some work. So when I was living in the Bahamas, we had a facility where we could bring bonefish into the lab, and we experimentally deep hooked them, and we used different lengths of monofilament line on the hook, and so we sampled the fish, periodically, and we could see how far that hook was going. And you have to remember, like, fish eat crunchy, hard things, right? They eat crunchy invertebrates. They eat fish with other bones. They eat like crabs and stuff. They're evolved to actually to deal with crunchy, hard, pointy, sharp objects. And it's not that those hooks rust out; is the fish pass them. And that's also another reason why it's important to use a barbless hook. If you use a barbless hook, the probability of that hook falling out and then we're spinning it up is a lot greater, or passing it. During that study, we, after 2 weeks, we had bonefish with like the hooks coming out the back end. And we're like, this is amazing. So they're able to work their way through. And we've actually seen, there have been some studies done on trout that actually show the same thing, and redfish, I believe. And so that's what we say, when in doubt, cut the line, because also, if you think about going back to my fish here, if it's deep hooked in the esophagus and you're in there trying to dig it out, remember where the heart is, right? And so if you're not going to hit the gills, and say you're really careful and you're avoiding the gills, as you're trying to dig that hook out, there's a chance that you're going to nick the heart or other vital organs. Mm-hmm. So we say predominantly cut the, if it's deeply hooked, cut the line. Yeah.
Okay. Andy, while I have the floor, another
Sure.
quick question is a little more political, but I'm just wondering what kind of dialogue, if any, your group or organization has had with the PETA folks who absolutely abhor catching worries.
Yeah. And that brings up the argument about, like, do fish feel pain? And there's science that it shows, there's some science that shows yes, they feel pain. There's some science that shows they don't. But if you look at the basic physiology and their neurological system of fish, they're, just because, again, it goes back to like the fact that they eat a lot of like crunchy, hard things. There's not a lot of nerve endings up around the mouth of a fish, and they're also, based on the structure of their brain, they don't have the same receptors to really perceive pain the same way that we do. That it's still the fight or flight reaction. There's resistance. But I think, going back to your point about PETA, we haven't interacted with them, but we were at a conference once where they came and picketed, and we said, this was in Brazil at the World Recreational Fisheries Conference, and we said, come on in. And we said, we're trying to develop science. We're using science to actually minimize impacts. We're not talking, and the more that we can minimize stress, the better it is for the fish. So come in and learn about some of the science. And so I think it's and in some places the animal rights movements have been successful, like in Germany, where catch and release is actually illegal. But if you 2 years ago, I was actually in Germany at a conference at a trade show there, consumer fishing show. And if you talk to a lot of people, they're like, yeah, we know it's illegal, but we ignore it. And we let the fish slip out of our hands because we realize that the economic benefits and the social benefits of fishing far outweigh, and the lack of evidence that fish feel pain far outweigh the other side of it. So it's a long answer to your question, but yeah, I mean, we'd certainly consider it. And, we also welcome the discussions with those folks, the animal rights folks, because, because recreational angling is so big, I don't think it's kind of going to go away. Yeah. Thanks for the questions, Paul. Appreciate it. I see more. William, how long does it fish?
I misspelled regenerate.
Oh, I got it. Okay, that's cool. So it depends on water chemistry and water temperature, but it can take up to 2 to 3 weeks for that slime to regenerate.
Wow.
And so, so we really want to think about it, especially when you're using, and I see this in, winter's coming up, right? And if you're going to go fishing and sometimes you're wearing gloves, and even any material that can be potentially abrasive can remove that slime. So the best thing you want to do, even though it's going to be sucky cold on your hands, is you want to use bare, wet hands. That's the best thing as possible. Good question. Christopher, I see. How long does a hook left in the lip or mouth last? Oh, good. So, I mean, we do see some situations where, depending on where you're fishing, sometimes you'll catch a fish that's already got some jewelry in it because it's broken off, right? And it's another reason why to use barbless hooks, because they will come out a lot faster. There hasn't been a lot of science done on hook retention in the corner of the mouth, and how that sort of relates to the timing. We've done some things with larger fish where we've actually put not only transmitters, we did this with pike and big pike. We didn't just put transmitters on the pike, but we also put transmitters on the lures. And we left the lures hanging off the face of the pike. And so we knew when there was a separation, how long that lure stayed on the fish, or when there was differences in their movement patterns. And it really does depend on whether the hook is barbed or barbless. If you're a conventional tackle angler and there's, you've got a plug that's got multiple treble hooks, obviously it's going to be a lot harder for that fish to get that bait off. We're seeing a lot more studies. Actually, we just conducted a study on smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, and northern pike that showed that switching those conventional baits to 2 single J hooks, barbless, significantly reduces handling time, significantly reduces hook damage. And does not impact the catch rates. So we're getting more and more of that science into the conventional tackle world, where it's a much greater proportion of the overall recreational fishery or conventional tackle folks. Sorry, I'm going to turn that off. And so we're starting to make more inroads there too. So great questions.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
If you get fishing quickly, a lot of times it's still got a lot of spunk and it's hard to handle. And one of the practices is to turn it upside down. And I'm just wondering, what's the balance there? Is that hurting the fish to turn it upside down?
Not at all. I think if that's one thing to calm it down so that you can take that hook out. And that's one of those righting reflexes, right? We actually do that. And in some fisheries, we've been working with angling groups and saying, if you're really unsure about the condition of your fish, purposely turn it upside down and see if it takes less than 3 seconds to right itself and swim away. If it takes less than 3 seconds and it swims away, it's good to go. So the other thing too that we've been advocating, if you're minimizing fight time and the fish is rather green, if it's not a fish that you're going to take a picture of, if it's your 20th trout of the day or whatever, you can use some of the dehooking tools where if you bring the fish close to you, you grab the leader, you run it down the line. You don't even have to touch the fish, whether it's green or not, and even if it's still kind of feisty, if you can get that dehooking tool down and get that hook out and you just let it go, that's the best. And we actually are just finishing up a study looking at 5 or 6 different dehooking devices, dehooking tools, and which ones are the easiest to use, which depending on hook placements and stuff like that. So that's going to be coming out soon, and it's going to be able to help people make decisions about what type of dehooking tool to use. Yeah,
Cool.
Great
Thanks,
question.
Andy.
No problem. I see a question from Jason. Mentioned that the effects of hot water temperature on fish. Can you comment on very cold temperatures? Absolutely. So I just had a PhD student do work. He's actually a semi-professional bass angler in Canada, and it's amazing how all these students that fish gravitate towards my lab. But we had that same question, and so what he was doing was looking at. We actually had a infrared thermometer, so one of those ones that you kind of just point. And we looked at the air temperature of the wind chill, the ambient conditions, whether you laid the fish on the ice, whether you kept it in the air, and then we put kind of like Fitbits. It's like we use these tools. It's called an accelerometer logger. It's the same thing that's in your iPhone that turns the screen when you turn it. It's in your smartwatch. And so we actually started putting these on fish to look at post-release activity. And so what he was able to demonstrate is that, if you're exposing a fish to air during winter, you're taking it usually out of water that's 4 degrees Celsius. So 37, 38, 39, that's the coldest that water is going to get. And you're putting it into air that's a heck of a lot colder than that potentially. And so that can affect gills, that can affect the slime layer. And he was able to show that air exposure, prolonged air exposure, and you see a lot of people laying their fish on the ice if they're ice fishing. That exposure really did impact the post-release activity of bass. And so he's going to do some follow-up studies looking at longer term. So we tracked them for about 20 minutes post-release, and we're able to show that they were struggling. Those ones that were exposed to colder wind conditions, winter conditions, were not as in good of shape. So you do need to be careful. And the same is true. So it might seem counterintuitive because at cold water temperatures, their metabolism is usually a lot lower. But they can still, if you think about those gill filaments, they're really fine. And if you expose them to air for too long, then that can impact recovery. One thing I forgot to mention about taking a fish out of water is what happens, right? You've got those fine gill filaments, the lamellae, and they're usually that's on them, that mucus helps keep debris off of them. And when you take a fish out of the water, the water is no longer there to support those gill filaments, and the gill filaments collapse. Aren't as functional. So it takes a little bit more time for those gill filaments to actually come up to optimum levels. So
any other questions for Andy?
Andy, I've got a comment and a question.
Sure. Hey, Kevin.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. First, I congratulate you and Sasha on this movement and what you've done over the, I don't know, what's it been, about 5 years now you've been going on this?
Yeah, I mean, we, the keep boom wet started probably about 5 or 6 years ago, but the biggest momentum, the biggest change is when it was rebranded in August of 2020 or 2019, because up until that point, people didn't know what it was. Was it just a movement? What is it? And it kind of had a sketchy name. If like it was, you could take it out of context. It was actually, people didn't like what it was named. And so with the rebranding and the legitimizing it as a 501c3, man, we have so many organizations and companies and groups that are now just like really glomming onto it, which is great. And that momentum, the biggest momentum we've seen is over the last like year and a half, which is great. So thank you for that, Kevin.
Well, I can honestly tell you, Andy, I don't think that there's anything more important with regards to fish conservation than what you guys are doing. And it's because it's science-based and it's part of getting people buying into true conservation and care for fish. And personally, and also on behalf of the chapter, you've made an incredible difference to me personally, as far as I did not ever think about this until I heard your presentation at our chapter 4 years ago. Never even crossed my mind. And my handling of fish and the way that I pursue fish and what I do is 180 degrees different, and it's as a result of you. And so I'm not only a believer, I'm a prophet, and sometimes I do go after some people, which and I did for on TU too, and so on a personal level, I thank you for that, because you've made me a better person for that. So thanks for that.
No worries.
But also, as far as our chapter, and you may or may not be aware of this, but I think that you were the one that got us hooked in with Matt Beaton, right?
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, and so 4 years ago, so you've made an incredible had an incredible impact on our chapter in two ways. First, our chapter, and I don't know if there's another chapter that has done this, but as a result of your presentation, our chapter adapted a policy that we would not be publishing any photos of fish out of water in any of our social media. And it was because of your presentation, and it was in honor of our past president, Jim Garapi, because prior to your presentation, our banner was this huge fish that Jim had caught, was on the banner of our chapter. And we knew that we had to take it down because Jim had passed. And then it just coincidentally, you made this presentation, and then we made a decision as a chapter to adopt this policy, no more fish out of water, in honor of Jim. And it was because of you. And so
that's
I'm going to give it Sasha too, not just you.
Awesome. That's awesome. That's really cool.
And then also at that presentation 4 years ago, you were there when we first rolled out as far as our initial results on the spawning study, and you said, "Hey, this is really cool." And then you and Neville put it together to get us in with Matt Beaton, and we met with Matt and we showed him what we had. He was blown away. And then we had our round table, and Sasha was at that, and everybody that was anybody when DEP and Mass Fish and Wildlife were at that meeting. And now we have a biologist on the river. We're finishing up the touches on an incredible FERC relicensing agreement that is going to have dramatic changes on the river. And it's because of you connecting us with Matt Beaton that we were able to develop that partnership. So thank you for that too. I mean, you don't know this, but you have made an amazing difference for our chapter and for me, and I thank you for that.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And actually, but this is where I would turn it around. Like, if you weren't willing to do these things, it wouldn't happen, right? And that's the whole thing about changing norms and about embracing these things. And that's why, like, I wish that more chapters would do that and recognize, like, and first, again, thank you very much. That was really kind of you. But where we also see the best practices for catch and release come into play is kind of like I don't want to say it, well, maybe that's not the good way to say it. It's like a gateway drug, right? It's like the gateway of, like, if you know that you can play a role in the outcome of each fish, and all of a sudden, wait a minute, I'm practicing conservation, then what's the next thing I can do? Right. So if I'm taking care of these fish, if I'm a steward of these fish because I'm changing my behavior, I'm not doing this, I'm keeping it in the water, then maybe I should go to the next town council meeting when they're talking about, changes in rivers, or, how I vote and all that stuff. And it really is a way to really draw people into feeling more conservation minded, and that they do have a that your chapter has been so successful over the last few years, and I follow it and I watch what you guys are doing, and I'm happy to facilitate anything and I can do to go back and take care of these guys, right? Because, like, at the end of the day, like, if we don't have fish, we're kind of screwed. Our sport goes away, a lot of other things go away, and even goes back to, like, how you are actually having conversations with higher up the food chain about best practices and stuff, and this is when we look at all the and when we were just starting, if you looked about best practices for catch and release, it was like a tiny little drop down over here that was it didn't resonate the same way, and it didn't mean that it wasn't as important as other things, but what it drew to us was it release, and that alone allowed the evolution of this. And I'm really honored the fact that your chapter had made that commitment, and I think I wish more would, and I think it would be great to kind of get that message out about how can each chapter make a difference, fighting all those, going back to that slide with the elephant in the room and all these big impacts. And sometimes people feel overwhelmed, how, all these bad things happening in our watershed, how can anything I do help? Well, guess what? Take care of the fish, each fish at a time. And that creates a more resilient fishery as you're fighting the other fights, it actually. That was awesome. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, and one, just not to monopolize the time here, but and that's where I think that the disconnect was with here we are, we're a conservation organization, we're spending thousands and thousands of hours and thousands of dollars, and on a national level, tens of, hundreds of thousands of hours, millions and millions of dollars to do all this conservation work. And here's something that each angler individually can do, and it doesn't cost you a red cent to do it. And you can have the biggest impact on the fish by just following your practices and looking within of, why do you need that photo? Why do you need it? You don't. And I fished, past summer, I went out to the Henry's Fork and I fished for 10 days. I did not take a single photo of a single fish. They came to net and they were immediately released. And I just felt so much better about what I was.
Awesome. That's so cool.
I think I think that's the next step for your organization, really. And I understand it's step by step, but it truly is for each angler to look within themselves as to what they're doing and why they're doing it. And are you truly serious about conservation and caring for the fish? Well, then this is something very easy that you can do, and you don't have to let that fish suffer at all.
Yeah. And I think that's helped in terms of the legitimizing of the organization. The number of presentations that we're giving, thanks to COVID with Zoom, like Sasha gave a release, and there's more organizations, nonprofits, and she gave a presentation yesterday to Michigan Sea Grant. So, federal agencies that are really trying to think more about how we can work on anglers to take that responsibility for each fish as we're fighting the other fights. And that it doesn't have to be a complicated message, but what it needs to be is a consistent and persistent message. That's one thing that we're, thankfully, in terms of the connections to a lot of the, Trout Unlimited chapters or industry partners or other things that we're I think more and more people are recognizing that pointing back to us as being that consistent, persistent message, it just takes the ambiguity out of it. We've come across some other organizations or some other some of our industry partners like, yeah, well, maybe we can do that and we'll reword it just a tiny bit. Like, no, don't reword it, because that's just going to make it more confusing to anglers, right? There has to be that consistent and persistent message tied back to the science, and we're seeing more and more groups getting it. And I think we've gained so much momentum, and I think there's a lot of growth and on the horizon. And I think it would be great. Like, I'd love to get, a testimonial from you guys about how it changed your chapter. I would love to do that. And we'd happy to, like, even if we're posting it on our, so I'm the unpaid social media intern for Keep Fish Wet. So my day job, I'm a professor. My evening job is I'm doing all the social media. So, I mean, I'm happy to like highlight that. You guys have done a lot. And so, if you get me a quote, I'm happy to post it and highlight that, because I want, at the end of the day, we want other groups to follow suit. So
anything that I can do for you, Andy, I'm more than happy to do that.
Awesome, Kevin.
I'm no longer on the board, so
might have to get approval.
We will.
I'm no longer on the board, so it's okay.
Andy, we'll definitely.
Thanks an awful lot, Andy.
Andy, we'll
Cool.
definitely send something along. And Kevin's right. It really has. I think it's made a difference. It was really nice to see just in the past year that TU National finally came around and Kirk Dieter wrote about it. I guess the second to last Trout magazine issue. And obviously that carries a lot of weight and it reaches a very large audience. So if we can do anything in just a small way to help you out, we're glad to do it. And Eric will be the new president come January, and maybe we can fashion a quote together from him on behalf of the chapter, and you can do with it as you please.
Cool. And that'd be awesome. And we also need to come up and fish with you guys more.
Definitely.
Sounds great.
That'd
Definitely.
be fun.
Very good. Any other questions for Andy before we close off this segment?
Thank you,
Okay.
Andy. Great job.
Just one last quick question. So the
Go
10
ahead.
second, the 10-second rule,
Yeah.
how did it vary by species? So trout less, bass more, ocean fish more, was there any?
No,
variation?
it's surprisingly. It's very context dependent, depending on water temperature, depending on how long you fight the fish. And so it's really hard to standardize it based on like one fish is more tolerant than others. There have been studies that have shown that, some trout, depending on how cold the water is, 15 seconds might be okay, but and come up with that one number. There have been studies that have shown that largemouth bass you can keep out of water for like 45 seconds and they'll be fine. But it's a placard that say, what are you fishing for today? Bass. What temperature is it? Okay, so you're good for 17 seconds. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to basically do that. So
Yeah.
and that's where we started to see that one review paper that was done on air exposure that said, look, across the board, 10 seconds seems to be like the sweet. Some of the research we've done on bonefish where it didn't even matter, like 0 seconds, because it was so hot and there was a shark over there. It didn't matter whether you took And so it's a tough, Brian, it's a tough question to address. But I think based on are more sensitive. Cold water species tend to be more sensitive. But I've also seen striped bass that have on a warm day on Brewster Flats with 2 seconds of air exposure, you let it go and it rolls on its belly. It rolls upside down and needs to be recovered. So you also can't sort of standardize, saltwater versus freshwater either. So
that's fine. We'll just follow the principles, right? And we should be good.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, very good. Well, that's it for our program tonight, everybody. Andy, again, thanks so much, and congratulations to you and Sasha both.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll pass that along. We decided not to tag team because she did a presentation last night, so I'll do it tonight,
okay.
so.